How's it?
Good, how are you?
I'm well. Nice to meet you both.
Hi,
Me
nice to meet
too.
you.
Thanks so much for doing this. I feel like I already know you because I mean, we've talked on Facebook, but I've seen so many of your podcasts that it's like, I feel like I know you already.
Like this face has been on your screen before. Yeah, more than happy to. It's a pleasure and a privilege.
Awesome.
Awesome. So, for anybody that doesn't know you, because I want you to give your own intro, can you just tell the audience who you are, what your background is, and what you do?
So I am currently a research fellow at the Auckland University of Technology, which is here in New Zealand where I'm at. And what I do there is I act as a supervisor to master's and PhD students. I do some guest lecturing, but primarily I mentor other early career researchers who are trying to do research in the space of physique and strength sports science, because really I'm just a muscle geek who's interested in the stuff that I like, and I decided to make a career out of that. So that is on the academic side. So I focus on nutrition, training, and psychology. So in terms of like the sustainability of participation in these sports, as they do have some risks, as all sports do. Um, and then on my kind of consulting side, I guess you could say, I'm the one of the co-founders and the chief science officer at 3dmusclejourney.com, which has been around for over a decade now, where we try to provide coaching as well as information and community support to lifters who are trying to find a sustainable relationship with drug-free bodybuilding and strength sport. And I do some writing as well. So I'm a reviewer for MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport, where we look over the the recent publications in the area of strength and physique sport. And I have books that I've written on the topic. And I also am very one-dimensional, as you'll find out. I also personally lift and compete in drug-free bodybuilding and strength sport. So can't ride a bike, but I can pick things up, put them down, and do that without anabolic steroids. So I'm very impressive.
That's helpful, definitely. Um, are you doing any like specific research projects right now?
Yeah, so it's been a little rough. New Zealand being kind of isolated from the rest of the world as an island, we've done a pretty good job in keeping COVID out, but of course it is getting here, so we have kind of like a delayed timeline. So we just recently had our COVID outbreak of Delta, which got under control, but that required us to be in lockdown here in Auckland, which is the biggest city, for like 4 months in total out of 2022. Sorry, 2021. What year is it? Where am I? And so that kind of derailed a lot of the research projects that I had both with students and on my own. But now we're getting back into the swing of things. We've got, 92% of the country vaccinated who are eligible. Um, and fingers crossed we'll be able to collect data. So we have restarted a weight gain study. So we're looking at different rates of intended weight gain and then actual weight gain to see how that impacts body composition change, whether they are quote unquote leaner gains or better for strength or maybe worse for them being lean, but you get more of them. We'll find out. And my students are also getting back at it. So I have a number of really awesome students who are doing PhDs and masters. So there's Kedrick Kwan, who is a powerlifting coach, powerlifter himself, and in the middle of his PhD, and he's looking at different weight cutting methods to see how they affect performance, psychology, as well as markers for hydration, sleep, so we can kind of figure out what's the best way to make weight without sacrificing performance on the platform. We've got Colby Sousa, who's doing his PhD. He's looking at different models of periodization within the week, like say an undulating approach with an easier day to see if we can prime performance on a following day. And we've also got some studies by my student Ivan Jukic from Croatia. He is looking at different alternatives to velocity-based training for having kind of like a cost-free alternative for prescription and monitoring. And we've also got my student Andrew, who is finishing up his master's, potentially moving on to the PhD, but nonetheless, he's looking at pre-workout carbohydrate intake and the effect on like acute resistance training performance. So a good, nice, broad spectrum of stuff. And then we've also got a few of my master's students who are looking at different traits associated with successful weight loss maintenance and personal trainers who are working with people who are trying to lose weight long term. So just got my fingers in many pies, and which is probably not a healthy thing to do for COVID. So definitely wash your hands, folks.
That's awesome, though. Those are some I mean, they're all really interesting topics. So
I think so.
yeah, definitely. So the first, and this, what we're going to talk about relates to some of those topics that you brought up. So the first thing that we wanted to talk about is what is NEAT? Can you explain that? And why is it so important when talking about metabolism?
Yeah, so NEAT is non-exercise activity thermogenesis. A much more simple way of putting that is that it's the calories you burn that don't or that aren't contributed to from basal metabolic rate and aren't contributed to by purposeful activity. So it includes a whole host of things, some of which are under your conscious control and some of which are not. So the fact that, I'm moving my hands while I talk right now is NEAT. However, how much posture control and shifting I have and fidgeting and how many calories I burn just moving about my day-to-day activities, which can change, which I'm sure we'll talk about, are also fall into the category of NEAT. So under the umbrella of total energy expenditure or total daily energy expenditure, NEAT for the vast majority of people is one of the smaller contributors. It's not negligible. It's like 20% or so on average, but it's something. But what's interesting about NEAT, and I'm probably jumping the shark on your next question, is that it is probably the most variable, despite it being a smaller contributor. And it probably contributes to the largest component of adaptive thermogenesis when people, or the changes in your energy expenditure, which can modify the expected weight gain or weight loss, depending on the person, out of all those factors. So we do know that basal metabolic rate can decrease slightly in response to dieting, or increase slightly in some people in response to overfeeding, which can make it harder to gain weight or lose weight. And we also know that the efficiency of the calories you burn during exercise activity can go up or down a little bit, but not to the same degree that NEAT changes. And then finally, we know that TEF is relatively a fixed factor. That's the thermic effect of feeding. That's basically the energy it costs to turn what you eat, as a food matrix into actual metabolizable energy. And that's typically like 10% of whatever you eat. So as you reduce calories, you reduce energy expenditure a wee bit, but you may have these adaptive responses in NEAT, which kind of eclipse all of that and tend to be the most adaptable factor of TDEE.
When people say adaptive metabolisms, and I know you've talked about your experience with having to get really, really low on calories in a contest prep, is that because of NEAT primarily?
Potentially, yeah. There's, the interesting thing about this area of research is that that old adage of like the 4 or 5 wise men who are all trying to explain a elephant and they're all blind. So one of them has the tail and he's like, that's a snake. One has the snout and he goes, yeah, it's a snake, but it's pretty thick. Like it's like more like a boa constrictor. And one's got the foot and he thinks it's some kind of chitinous insect or whatever. And we kind of have that in this space. So we have the researchers in relative energy deficiency, which kind of got born out of the research on the female athlete triad, looking at some of the consequences of low energy availability and the etiology of why people develop symptoms of REDS in the female athlete triad, which is relative energy deficiency in sport, which is linked to simply not eating enough for your level of activity and body mass, right? Which obviously is going to cross over into metabolic adaptation. There's the metabolic adaptation / adaptive thermogenesis literature, which is very interested in just the energetics of that. So REDS is saying, okay, so energy expenditure goes down. How does that affect your physiology? The conversation on the kind of weight loss and obesity epidemic, metabolic adaptation, adaptive thermogenesis side is more about how much energy are you burning less than predicted? What is it related to? What's the mechanism? Can we correct for it? And is it related to your potential success or failure at weight loss? Is it a problem? To what degree? What do we do about it? Yada, yada. And then we also have data on overtraining. So the actual process of having too high of energy expenditure for what you can acutely adapt to and overloading too quickly. And that has many, many shared symptoms of REDS, and REDS is also an athlete. So there's this crosstalk in all of these systems. So they all come into play. So my prior anecdotal experiences of going, hey, I'm doing a lot of cardio, I'm cutting my calories low, I'm stuck at 190 pounds, this doesn't make sense mathematically. It touches into each one of those. I'm The worst contest prep I had was in the heyday of HIIT for bodybuilders, where we all justified doing these 15-second sprints, 45-second rest periods for 20 minutes, like 3 times a week, sprinting more than sprinters and thinking there was nothing wrong with that, while also dieting and doing weight training 5 days a week. So there was definitely probably some overtraining going on in that experience of mine. I was also definitely in a state of low energy availability, which is just somewhere you have to get to for getting shredded. And then I was experiencing some adaptive, changes in my energy expenditure. And that connects to another line, which is kind of separate from nutrition research, but has come out of anthropology. You guys are probably familiar with Herman Poncer and the constrained model of energy expenditure. It's got kind of popular in the main space. The quick internet soundbite version of that is cardio does nothing, because if you keep doing it, then other factors go down, and you have this constrained energy expenditure. And look at these hunter-gatherer tribes who still exist in the modern world, compare them to us. What it really is saying is it's just a nonlinear increase. It passed a certain threshold. As you add more activity, other aspects of TDE go down as exercise activity goes up, to have a quote-unquote constrained model. And the degree to which that happens is individual, but it's never a complete, it doesn't break the laws of physics. Like if you run a marathon, you're not going to be like, oh, only burn 3,000 calories. That's not the way that works, but you might burn, 20, 30% less than expected. So when someone is doing a crap ton of activity, is in a state of low energy availability, and is trying to lose weight, if they do that aggressively, and if they have certain physiological characteristics, they might experience, elements of all of these. So I think that is definitely what I and many bodybuilders experience, where the math doesn't add up. And what they're seeing is, yes, they're burning those calories during activity. They're burning far fewer calories other times. NEAT is probably one of those factors that is going down the most, although there probably are also reductions in BMR, which could be driven by a combination of downregulation of physiological factors and processes, as well as losses of organ tissue. Not like in a dangerous way. That's probably a normal adaptation to dieting. And this is also seen in changes in physiological function of those organs. So like in women, it's very normal to see disruption of the menstrual cycle if you are in a state of low energy availability. And that when it happens and to what degree and whether it becomes full-blown amenorrhea is very much dependent on the methods used, the individual person, the length of time, potentially how lean they get, et cetera. So yeah, my last contest prep season in 2019 went far better than that 2009 one, where I decided to also become an amateur sprinter. One, I didn't tear my hamstring, which also happens when you try to be an amateur sprinter who's dieting. But two, I didn't have the same kind of plateaus in weight loss. I did have to drop my calories low, but I didn't see this huge mismatch between what I thought made sense and what didn't. And a big part of that was that I was not leveraging cardio so much, and I did not feel nearly as overtrained, and I was much better at modulating my training to be appropriate for my level of energy and subjective recovery.
Is NEAT genetic? And I know you said we can control some of it and some others we can. How can we control it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are definitely what we call phenotypes associated with NEAT. I would suspect they are heavily genetically influenced, but I wouldn't pretend to know. Like phenotype describes a convergence of factors that describes a category for somebody, which almost always does have a genetic component. And there are what's called spendthrift and thrifty people. And that kind of generally describes those who are much less likely to have adaptations in energy expenditure and those who are more likely to have it, right? So these are kind of arbitrary distinctions, though. Like when you figure, like if I took a big cohort of 300 people and I went, all right, let's see whose TDE adapted the most, I would just take like the upper quartile and lower quartile and call them spendthrift and thrifty and be like, aha, that's not really, I didn't do genetic testing or figure out what is related to this. So there's no neat sciencey answer to this. However, if we go back to what I was saying earlier, we understand that NEAT encompasses both subconscious and conscious things. There are some things you can do to control at least the conscious portion. So, for example, your step count explains a lot of the variance in NEAT, but not all of it. So you may not be aware just how much like you spend seated. You don't get up, like, you hold your bladder longer when you're dieting, and you like when you go pee, it's like, all right, I really have to go pee, You don't fidget as much, all this stuff. But if you are to hold your step count relatively constant, so let's say before you start a diet, you chuck on the Fitbit or turn on the function on your phone, and you're like, okay, I have 7,000 steps a day. And you decide now, once I start dieting, I'm going to maintain 7,000 steps. You will see a smaller reduction in NEAT otherwise if you were someone who did experience these reductions in NEAT normally, where you might normally drop to 5,000 steps while still feeling like you're doing the same amount of stuff. You're hunting for that parking spot a little longer. You're leaning on your shopping cart, all these other things. So your step count can kind of go down in ways that you might not expect. For example, I've seen people who I watched them prep for a bodybuilding show, and I train in the same gym as them. And I can tell when they're in the off season because they're walking between places, getting sips of water, talking to people like, hey, what's up, man? High five. And then during prep, there's a bench and there's the squat rack, and those are the only two places they are. And they're like, head down. And it's just like, let's just get through it. I'm trying not to move at all. And they turn into sloths who then squat sometimes. So like if you were to maintain your step count, you control a fair amount of that. And one thing we've seen at 3DMJ with our clients is that when we go through that process of getting step count tracked, and then we primarily modify nutrition and slowly add steps over time, before when we would just assign a certain amount of caloric expenditure estimated for cardio, we wouldn't actually know if their step count is changing while they're also burning more calories from cardio. We typically see now in the last few years more consistent weight loss with fewer changes. So anecdotally, and that does align with some of the research we have, you can get at some of it, but obviously we can't coach like posture. I mean, we could really make people crazy if we wanted to make them think about every movement they made throughout the day to try to make all subconscious movement conscious, but I wouldn't recommend that.
Yeah, like make sure you're tapping your foot 50 times like every few minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. All we need to do is constantly thinking about the amount of energy expended we have, and that'll have a great relationship with the sport, and your life will be wonderful, like easy. You're always dieting. That's what I need people to think, basically. That's how you have a good, healthy relationship with food in your body. Yeah.
I talked about this because we had Dave McConey on for the last episode, and I talked about this with him. Like, I've never done a contest prep, but I've dieted down pretty lean to the point where, like, I knew it wasn't healthy for me to maintain that. And I noticed, like, so many adaptations just because I'm very aware of myself and how I normally am. And I like walking and I like being active, but I don't really think about it so much. And when I was, at the end on like 11 to 1200 calories and getting in like a certain amount of activity a day, I was so sedentary. It was like, and you do think about it all the time, like, oh my gosh, do I have to really walk to that far to get to the grocery store right now? And it's just like a few more spots up.
Yeah, it becomes it can possess all of your free thoughts and it can lead to a lot of anxiety. And that's honestly, like, people will often ask me about like what's too lean, or what's too much time to spend in a deficit, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And really it comes down to like, you don't experience RED-S and go like, oh, I had no idea. We've known for literally decades, since the 40s, that the process of putting yourself through unsustainable weight loss and trying to maintain it has psychological effects. Like, you feel this stuff happen, so when you find yourself obsessed with food and like, I wonder if I can add xanthan gum to all my meals to bulk them up. Like, okay, like this, you've now gotten to an unsustainable place. Or if, do I need to take a lap in my living room to get my step count up? Like, all right, this is getting out of hand. Like, this isn't a good place for you. We need to look at, explore other options or possibilities, and question this goal and the motivation behind it. So that is a really big piece that I think it's fun to talk about the physiology, but I think sometimes it's always important to investigate our own and our clients' desires for why they're trying to manipulate their behavior and physiology, because it might be leading them to a place that they don't really want to be, but they are pushed to do it due to poor body image, social pressures, etc. So
I know that you've also talked a lot about macro counting versus autoregulatory eating, and when is the time to stop macro counting and all of that. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of somebody, if they want to maintain their weight and get away from that?
Yeah. So first, I think I have to preface this with, macro counting is something that can be used in many different ways, but because macros grew out of the if it fits your macros movement, we often view them when someone brings up, I'm tracking my macros as, oh, you have targets for protein, fat, and carbs, and you're hitting them within some amount for a weight loss, weight gain, or maintenance goal. However, you can absolutely track your macros while eating in an auto-regulated fashion. You can eat what you want and then find out what you ate, right? And I'm not saying that tracking them wouldn't have some influence on what you eat. Like if you're going to track that donut at work, it might change you from whether or not you want to have that donut at work. At least goes into your calculus because now you're a little more consciously aware of yourself doing it. But there is a difference between tracking something to modify it and tracking something to be aware of it. And they have potentially different risks. So I think an important thing to understand is that intentional dieting, while it has a potential for a health benefit, it is not a risk-free strategy, right? And when we see, people in the wild, if you will, try to do this on their own without necessarily having any guidance from a dietitian or an online nutrition coach or a trainer, or who aren't necessarily very well educated, and they're just coming into contact with whatever they figure out to use on social media or the internet, the probabilities that they will long-term maintain that weight loss are really low, to the point where they are potentially more than likely going to regain the weight and maybe come away with some lowered self-efficacy and just feeling shitty about themselves. So that's not great. And however, when we look at long-term trials investigating not complete weight loss maintenance, but a clinically relevant amount, say maintaining at least 5 to 10% of your weight loss long-term after an initial weight loss period. So being okay with some weight regain potentially, but still getting the health benefits from it. If someone has a multidisciplinary team who gives them education, support, including cognitive behavioral therapy, or potentially acceptance-based therapy in combination with that, exercise, nutrition changes, and we look at that for 5 or 6 years. Now we're looking at maybe like a 40% success rate, which is bad, but way better than like 1 in 300. So that big preface is just to say, when someone does decide, I want to do intentional weight loss through whatever method, whether it's following a meal plan or using intentional macro-based tracking, they need to be aware that they're going to Vegas, and the house often wins. So they really need to make sure that they play the right games and know how to count cards, and et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not going to take that metaphor too far, or it'll fall apart. But so yes, so macro tracking is a method of having an accurate gauge of the energy you're taking in, because we get energy from the macronutrients. There's 4 calories per gram of carbs and protein, 9 calories per gram of fat. And it is a very effective way that has been previously positioned as a better approach than simply kind of quote unquote clean eating, because it doesn't have restrictions on the food you eat, which I agree is great. However, that's not the only aspect of some of that anxiety and restrictive eating that we talked about previously. And a lot of people, well, I'll use myself as a good story, because I kind of came into the game myself a few years before If It Fit Your Macros took off. And then I now live in the post If It Fit Your Macros reality. So originally it was like, here's the bodybuilding approved list of foods, and you can eat some ones that are not on that in the off season, because gaining weight is hard to do when you're eating, oats and chicken. But when you do contest prep, you go through a systematic process of restricting your diet to basically a handful of foods. In the end, you're eating grilled chicken breast and broccoli and nothing else. And that's how you get shredded. And that inadvertently resulted in a calorie deficit that scaled with the adaptive nature of weight loss we talked about. And, if you happen to have the right genetics and you push hard enough, you'll be reasonably lean and good to get on stage. Enter If It Fits Your Macros era, and it's like, hey, we can actually make targeted reductions in carbs and fat, maintain protein, have a little more flexibility in our diet, hopefully preserve a little more sanity. And we started seeing people actually getting better in bodybuilding in the era of amateurs getting striated glutes popped up in natural bodybuilding in the last 10 years, I would say. Now, 10 years after those folks felt like they had this panacea of flexibility, because it was compared to eating 5 foods versus any food, so long as I hit these numbers, those people are going, maybe it's not that flexible that I have to take a food scale with me to a restaurant to stay on track. And when I'm not tracking, I just tend to binge eat. And this is actually just another form of rigid restraint, which is not great. So tracking macros to hit specific targets long term, I think outside of certain clinical cases, where someone is potentially trying to rehabilitate from a form of anorexia or another potential eating disorder, which I'm not qualified to really get into the details, but I know that sometimes that is the pathway towards at least initial remission. You probably don't want to be tracking your calories all the time. So people have probably heard of intuitive eating, and I'm really glad that you used the terminology auto-regulated eating, because intuitive eating kind of has like a TM next to it, and it encompasses a broad set of behaviors and philosophies. But it's generally trying to teach someone to be able to identify their hunger and satiety signals and their body's needs and what they actually want, rather than kind of rebounding and eating everything in response to dieting or being in a restrictive state where you're dysregulated on either end of that spectrum. But going, all right, does this serve me? Do I feel that this is a nourishing food to eat right now? Do I want it? Which can include thoughts about health, performance, etc. But it is weight neutral. Auto-regulated eating doesn't necessarily have to be weight neutral. That is saying I could put myself into a deficit or a surplus, but I'm not going to have specific targets. So they can potentially share some elements. So for example, you could auto-regulate in the same way we have a 1 to 10 RPE scale, a rating of perceived exertion, with 10 being max and 1 being so easy I probably didn't even work out. That was a single rep at a 10, like that was a 1 RM, right? You can have a hunger and satiety scale. So at a 5, I'm stuffed to the brims and don't poke my stomach or you're going to get puke on you. And at a 1, I'm ready to eat my own arm kind of thing. So if you were to keep yourself at, say, a 2 to 3 most of the time, you would probably be in a deficit, and you wouldn't have to track macros necessarily. And you could just have a habit-based approach of going, for the last few years, I've gotten used to eating 4 meals a day with a protein serving and a fruit and a vegetable, and then a carbohydrate source and a fat source. And I'll modify my carbohydrate and fat source to put myself at a 2 to 3 on the hunger satiety scale most of the time. So I don't want to get really, really hungry, but I also don't want to get that full, and that would be a relatively harsh deficit. I can have that range span from 2 to 4, and I'd probably be at maintenance. Or if I want to bulk, I can go to 3 to 5. So I'm never getting that hungry, and I am eating until I'm pretty stuffed sometimes, if that's what that person needs to do. And then I look at my body weight change over time. So instead of manipulating macros, we're manipulating our satiety and our hunger signals and tracking it in such a way to try to manipulate body weight. And I think that's a very valid way of doing things. That the upside of that is that it's still tracking, it's still potentially intentional dieting, but it brings back someone's awareness of hunger and satiety, while typically in dieting circles, the goal is to try to totally ignore those things and turn them off and not succumb to hunger, when instead you might be able to use it and modulate your energy intake to more accurately match your expenditure to put you in a reasonable deficit. But it does take time, energy, self-awareness, and changing of your food environment to be able to get reliable signals that you can identify. And sometimes that can take, if someone has been dieting since they were a kid, which is unfortunately not uncommon in our society, that may be a nigh impossible task, or it might be something that takes them years. There's some qualitative interviews of collegiate female athletes who have been eating for fuel and performance for most of their life, and some of them might have even had some disordered eating patterns as kids for societal reasons. And now they're 22, for the first time they're not competing, and they want to just eat to live. And they find that process eventually liberating, but extremely confusing. And it's like, I'm learning to eat for like the first time, just based on normal satiety and hunger signals, like, the average animal does. Like, why does your cat go up to the food bowl, eat, and then walk away and then stop? If it's a house cat, he might just keep eating until he's fat because he's so inactive that hunger actually gets dysregulated. But if it's an outdoor cat, he or her might decide to stop at some point, and they maintain a relatively healthy weight outside of any other potential health issues. So it's trying to get back to that. And that actually can take coaching from a trained dietitian in the intuitive eating realm. But if you have that ability to gauge satiety and hunger, that is a boon to you as an athlete or someone who just wants to live in our modern food environment, because then you can unshackle yourself from having to hit certain macros and hopefully be able to move forward in like this auto-regulated fashion, which most people find more freeing, at least eventually. It might be very intimidating at first if you're used to tracking macros. So that was a very long answer, but
No, that was good. I actually didn't say, I would have asked about intuitive eating, but because I actually didn't even know what that really referred to until I listened to Dr. Gabrielle Fondaro talk about it. And, and yeah, I realized I was using the term completely incorrectly. So that's why I kind of switched my terminology with that.
And that's not uncommon. There's a bunch of leading figures who are kind of been more siloed, and I include myself in this. If we go a few years back, in the kind of nutrition focused space, where the research we've read and the experiences we've had as trainers, you know, intuitive eating could be interpreted just as two words together if you don't actually know the kind of the TM behind it is eat what you want. And we're like, well, that's the problem most of our clients have had. They don't have the education or the food environment or the activity levels or the sense of self-efficacy and self-worth for that to be a good thing for them. So this is terrible. They're just that's how we got to the obesity epidemic. But that's quite a strawman argument if you're talking about intuitive eating, quote unquote TM, which is something that people have to be trained in to then help their clients use. So I think that's good. We're starting to realize what we don't know in this industry, and I myself have said things like that. And thanks to Gabby, shout out to Dr. Fondaro, I've also shifted towards a more accurate representation of the data and the terminology.
What is the recovery diet? And would you use that or reverse dieting for a lifestyle client post diet?
So yeah, I think very importantly, the recovery diet is something we termed at 3DMJ as a specific strategy to recover from the end of a contest prep season in competitors. And recovery is needed due to all the things we talked about for what is required to get into stage shape. There is no way to get down to essential levels of body fat, which is essentially what that whole striated glutes era that I've talked about, which you'll even see women in the bodybuilding division at the highest level achieve now, even in drug-free federations. Getting that lean, it's almost unavoidable unless you've got 1 in a million genetics to be in a state of experiencing all the symptoms of REDS. It's rare to have your menstrual cycle as a woman. Everybody's feeling like trash. Most of the time, your free thoughts wander to pizza. I mean, that's kind of where you got to be for the last few months, and that is a state that requires recovery if you want to get back to the goal of bodybuilding, which is, believe it or not to just get shredded and look amazing for Instagram, but to actually build muscle and then be more competitive long term. So it is very easy to get hyper focused on getting leaner and leaner every week because that is the nature of that phase of competitive physique sport. So to recover psychologically and physiologically, what you need to do is actually regain a healthy amount of body fat and regain lost muscle tissue, both of which are associated with different aspects of metabolic adaptation. When you lose lean body mass, that can affect hunger signaling, and you won't get satiety back until you recover it all. And when you lose fat mass, which is what secretes leptin, which is one of those master controllers and kind of the HPA axis, that is going to have an impact on energy expenditure and some other aspects. So you need to regain the lost lean body mass and get to whatever is a sustainable level of body fat for you, which is both affected by environmental, behavioral, and genetic factors. So what that looks like in practice, the recovery diet, when someone's at the end of a contest season and is going to have some time off before they go through the contest prep phase again, is going to be the largest surplus they would have in the off season. So if they're maybe normally trying to gain 1 or 2 pounds per month, they might be trying to gain 1 or 2 pounds a week for, say, 1 to 2 months, which is a huge surplus. We're talking 500 to 1,000 calorie surplus. And that's, well, I'll get to that in a second. And they do that until they get to what is a more sustainable body fat level, which much more quickly reverses a lot of the negative physiological adaptations, the symptoms of REDS and low energy availability, and puts them in a position where more of their off season can be happy, healthy, and getting yacked as possible. The quote unquote reverse diet is the strategy is basically to build your food up as high as you can and to stay as lean as possible while doing that, to quote unquote set you up for better success long term. And that kind of falls on its face because so long as you maintain a very low body fat level, even if you are able to regain a fair amount of lean body mass, you will be in that state of under recovery. And we have some empirical data to show that. We have very high correlations between leptin, energy expenditure, and body fat. And we also have a case study of a drug-free female figure competitor who basically described what this person did in the post-contest period. They only increased their stage weight by like 10 from their stage weight by like 10 or 11 pounds, and in that year and a half, they did not regain their menstrual cycle. So like 71 weeks where their menstrual cycle had not regained, despite the slow weight gain and putting on increasing calories, but it was probably too sporadic, too far and few between, and also probably had a fair amount of psychological anxiety going along with it. So anyway, as opposed to trying to be super careful post-show, it is this intentional, purposeful goal of putting on body fat, which is a really important phase of going, okay, yes, striated glutes are the goal for stage, but really that's quite weird. Like butts should not look like walnuts. That's abnormal. This is unhealthy. Let's focus on we have to shift our focus onto getting into the off season and having much more body acceptance, and maybe focusing a lot more on gaining strength and performance and being healthy and happy again, which is can be quite a U-turn ask of someone psychologically, which is why the coach's role is very important here. So I know I'm talking about the context of physique sport, but when we tried the more strict reverse diet, the ostensible goal was to be able to start the next diet with less fat to lose, and be in a really, really good position. It just never worked. And what it resulted in was something resembling bulimia. People who would be able to stick to the reverse diet for a week and then have a blowout and then try to cut it back down. And this is after the contest season is over, right? So it's this, and also having your coach tell you, here's the goal, you got this, fail. Here's the goal, you got this, fail. And going, oh, I just had this empowering experience. I got on stage, I feel like I mastered my body, which is kind of the drug of bodybuilding for a lot of people, is the ability to push themselves to a very hard place that your body's telling you shouldn't do this, and you go, no, I got this, and then finding that you can't stop yourself from going to Taco Bell twice in the same day. It really can destroy that identity as an athlete, as someone who has willpower, etc. And it can really wreak mental havoc. So ironically, telling someone after they've been on a diet of 2,000 calories to eat 2,300 calories is more likely to have them eat, say, 7,000 calories eventually, than having them on a diet of 2,000 calories and saying, all right, I want you on 3,200 calories. If they overeat on 3,200 calories, it ends up being more like 4, So by making part of the plan to overeat, you reduce some of that swing back responsiveness to being overly restricted. I've seen time and time again where someone who tried to reverse diet and then they go to the recovery diet, they actually gain less weight despite the goal to be the exact opposite of that. So that's all related to contest prep for bodybuilders. For the lifestyle client, their goal should be to get to a body mass and body fatness that is sustainable. So the deficit shouldn't be as severe. If they go through phases of weight loss where they feel like, oh, I can't sustain that, that's fine, but it should probably be interspersed with periods of maintenance eating intentionally, and not just from any kind of, metabolic adaptation standpoint, but from the idea of, all right, I've been living in a 300-pound body, I've lost 30 pounds, and now I want to live in a 270-pound body with this new understanding of nutrition, health, my goals, hopefully a changed sense of self-identity. And I've been on a 1,000 calorie surplus this whole time, but now I get to add those calories back in. What do my meals look like? What do I buy at the grocery store? What does that look like in my family dynamic? And giving them an opportunity to eat at maintenance and kind of get a breath of fresh air, if you will, or a break, get their head above water, and practice living at maintenance is a great way to break up periods of dieting. And I think it's really important because the average person tends to get blinders on the weight loss phase to really think about the long term. Are we in a rush? Like, yes, I know you want to lose 30 pounds for your 10-year wedding anniversary, but do you want to be able to play with your grandkids? Do you want to live to 80? Those types of things are what our job as coaches is to reconnect, or not tell them, but ask our clients, figure out what's really valuable to them, and then connect their goals to that rather than kind of that tunnel vision, short-term thinking. So they go, oh, I guess if I lose 10 pounds this year instead of 30, I'm still moving in the right direction. I'm still getting healthier. And is there anything special about being under 200 pounds, or is that just a goal I set for myself? Maybe I should focus more on health and what do I need to be healthy? And if that happens at 240 pounds and I'm healthy, and I'm happy, is that okay? Like, how truly attached am I to the aesthetics, or is it more about acceptance and my own personal happiness? So there should be a lot of thinking along those lines. So for a lifestyle client, it might look a little, ironically, it might look a little more like a reverse diet, because they shouldn't be in a really low energy availability state. They shouldn't be in a huge deficit. And the goal is not to necessarily regain weight, but get to maintenance. So it might be like, okay, we're going to cut your cardio in half, but we're still going to maintain resistance training, because we know that maintaining a certain amount of physical activity and steps is associated with regulating satiety and maintaining weight loss when we look at the National Weight Control Registry. And we're going to add in 500 calories, and let's see what life is like. And then you might try to slowly bump that up. Like, let's see how much we can get away with eating without you regaining weight. And then you would want to take that kind of macro tracking approach, if that's what they were using, and start shifting it more towards the autoregulatory side, so that they can not need to be, tied to MyFitnessPal on a food scale to maintain that weight, because then we know that's probably just a ticking time bomb of once that becomes too restrictive and they go the other direction.
So one more question I wanted to ask you, which is kind of for me as well, because something I've always had issues with myself, and part of this is because I've had disordered eating in the past, and when you have that, it kind of always, the thoughts stay with you, even though I'm more aware of them and I don't act them out like I used to.
Mm-hmm.
But when you are a lifestyle client and you've gotten to a body fatness or a weight that you feel is sustainable for you, and you're at a lower caloric intake than you'd like to be, how do you find that maintenance in order to, like, again, not gain too much weight and feel like you took 5 steps back? And also, how long do you advise people? I've already asked this to a few people, but I want to get your opinion. How long do you have to stay in that elevated caloric range until you try to bump it up more?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of potential answers to this. And I think there's a different answer when you're in that acute phase where you are adding calories back in. That could be weekly, adding 100 calories per week, initially. Versus, okay, we've added what we think we can add, and now we're going to shift towards more just auto-regulated eating and trying to hang out here. And I think at that point, it's a really good idea to try to focus, because like you were saying, in your personal experience, and if I put words in your mouth that are non-representative, just correct me. But what I'm hearing is there's behaviors and there's the cognitions behind them, right? And the behaviors can be a problem depending on how severe the disordered eating or eating disorders are. But a lot of the times the source of the unhappiness is not just that, and the result of maybe I'm in a larger body than I want, or I don't like the way I look. I don't like my body shape. That's connected to the cognitions and then the behaviors. It's kind of this backward chain. But the cognitions is kind of the root. So what is really important is to make sure that the person is getting access to the right mental health professionals and is actively doing the work to reinvestigate, like, what is the root of that? It often comes down to, like, why is my self-worth so attached to my body shape? And that can go back to stuff your mom said to you when you were 6. That can be exacerbated by shit you see on Instagram today in 2022. That can go to the fact that I read comic books, and this is not just a male-female issue. Of course, it does affect more women, but if you look at the progression of, like, Luke Skywalker toys from the 70s, he went from actually looking like Mark Hamill, this kind of a dude in a robe, to looking like the Hulk, in a robe, and over the few years. So, I don't know why I was attracted to the sport of bodybuilding. Maybe because I grew up watching Schwarzenegger movies. So I think some of our self-identity is often tied to our gender, which is often tied to a certain stereotypical body shape. And if we don't fit that, here we are. If that gets reinforced by family or environment, that can be a really difficult thing to change that cognition. But ultimately, if we remove all of that societal stuff out of the way, we want to be accepted, and we want to feel that we have self-worth. So to some degree, kind of diversifying your happiness portfolio is what's required. We have to have more things that feed into our sense of self-worth than the way we look. And we have to really kind of do some work to go, like, what are the things about me that I like, and what are the things I value? And how do I need to be able to do those things? Okay, well, I need to be healthy. So what is health? Well, health is not a shape. Health is maybe some objective health markers or my functionality. Can I climb? Can I run? Can I do whatever is valuable to that person? And trying to slowly work on the process, which is way easier said than I'm making out to be, of reprogramming where your values lie, so that hopefully you can get to a point where, the subjective line in the sand of, well, I'm fine with a little bit of a muffin top, but not this much, or I don't want my thighs to rub together, or whatever it is. Or I'm okay if I wear a shirt, but man, I got to wear a one piece. Like, whatever point you are, you basically want to try to realign your acceptable to you body shape that doesn't trigger that inner critic with what is actually healthy and functional, which is typically higher in body fat than what Instagram tells you is acceptable from its photoshopped anabolic steroid outed models that are always modeling for us and helping us hate ourselves. So that is kind of where we want to get to, and that process is really what's going to dictate some of those changes in food, because it is also quite uncomfortable to live in a body, even if, like, I would love to change those cognitions. I haven't yet, and I don't like the way I look. So it is this dissonance that is very difficult for people to manage. So sometimes it is a matter of, all right, I'm going to be working on that, and I'm just going to kind of hit pause on my focus on weight loss or shape management, and I'm going to see what is the calorie intake that maintains my health and that I can eat without feeling hungry or food focused. And if that has me at 10% heavier than I would like, that's fine for now. I'm going to hit pause on my shape-based, cognitions and goals, and I'm going to negotiate with that part of myself and say, hey, I understand that we don't like the way we look right now, but for now I want to focus on my health. I want to focus on my academic career. I want to focus on my career and my family and my fitness, and also still working on those cognitions. And then you can kind of keep revisiting that every once in a while, and hopefully that highly self-critical, judgmental part of you internally is starting to align more with the things that you are trying to value. And so that wasn't like 50 calories a week, which might have been what we were kind of looking for, but is more like, hey, we don't want to be in a state, and you can't maintain a state where you're constantly food focused and you're just always a little bit hungry, and you have to be careful. So it is more than that, despite the fact that might have you at a body fat level that you don't want, and then working on realigning or trying to align, maybe for the first time, your sense of self with your body shape.
Thank you so much for coming on. Can you tell everyone where they can find you if they are interested in coaching, where they can go for that, where they can read mass, all of that?
Absolutely. So a couple things I would say, since we delved a lot into some of the psychological domains that I interact with, is I myself have a PhD in muscle science. So I am not a psychologist by any means. I've been a trainer and a coach for a long time, and I'm very privileged to work alongside folks like Amanda Rizzo, who is a licensed clinical counselor, has her master's degree in psychology, and consults with us at 3D Muscle Journey. And we always bring her on anytime we have a competitor or non-competitor who is needing her expertise and it's outside of her scope. And also Steve Taylor, who's a registered dietitian and has his master's degree in dietetics and exercise nutrition. So both of them are folks who, if you're thinking, oh man, that Eric guy really sounds like he knows how to help people with the psychology of dieting, I do, because I'm a sport coach. But honestly, I am a physique and sport and strength coach, and so are my colleagues, Jeff, Alberto, and Brad. And because our sport, the risks aren't getting a concussion like in American football, they are developing an unhealthy relationship with your body and food. We have them on staff. But if you are looking for like lifestyle management and help with these issues, absolutely check out 3dmusclejourney.com. That's the number 3, the letter D, and then check out About Us. And it's worth, if you're kind of looking for sustainable, healthy approaches for general fat loss, I'd contact Steve. And if you're looking with help with some of the cognitions and the behaviors and feeling like you're kind of stuck in that dissonance, definitely reach out to Amanda and they will work with you one-on-one. But if you're a competitor or someone who has non-competitive bodybuilding or strength aspirations, then definitely reach out to our like primary contact us, and we'll help you with that. And we do have the ability to link you up with other professionals when it's outside of our scope. So anyway, 3dmusclejourney.com. You can also find links from there to my books, to Mass, to our podcast. And the only other place where you might want to find me would be on Instagram at Helms3DMJ, where I promise I won't spend all my time making you hate yourself like most accounts, but hopefully educating you by linking you out to the other podcasts and stuff I do. And then I also have Iron Culture, my podcast with Omar Yusuf, where we explore the history, science, and culture of all things in the lifting world.
Which is an awesome podcast, by the way. I've learned a lot from that.
Thank you. That's awesome to hear.